The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine marble floors of the Royal Palace of Astoria as Charlotte Williams adjusted her crisp white uniform for what she believed would be another routine day. At 26, she had earned her position as head of the palace security detail through years of dedication, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those under her care. Her colleagues respected her sharp instincts, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her fierce loyalty to the royal family she served. Charlotte's journey to this prestigious position hadn't been easy. Born into a middle-class family in the suburbs of the capital city, she had always dreamed of serving her country in a meaningful way. Her father, a retired police officer, had instilled in her the values of justice, integrity, and selfless service from an early age. Her mother, a nurse, had taught her the importance of caring for others and putting their needs before her own. These lessons had shaped Charlotte into the woman she had become, strong, compassionate, and utterly devoted to her duty. The path to becoming a royal guard had required years of rigorous training. Charlotte had excelled in every aspect of her preparation, from hand-to-hand combat to advanced security protocols. She had studied international law, diplomatic procedures, and crisis management. Her instructors had praised her natural leadership abilities and her uncanny ability to read people and situations. By the time she completed her training, Charlotte had established herself as one of the most promising candidates the Academy had ever seen. Now, 3 years into her service, Charlotte had become an integral part of the royal household security apparatus. She knew every corner of the vast palace, every potential vulnerability, every exit and entrance. She had memorized the daily routines of each member of the royal family and had developed personal relationships with many of them based on mutual respect and trust. The king and queen regarded her not just as a protector, but as a trusted confidant, someone whose judgment they valued and whose presence brought them comfort. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. Charlotte couldn't quite put a finger on it, but her instincts, honed through years of training and experience, were telling her that today would not be ordinary. As she conducted her morning briefing with her team, reviewing the day's schedule and security protocols, she noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere around the palace. Staff members seemed more tense than usual. Whispered conversations stopped abruptly when she approached, and there was an undercurrent of nervous energy that she found troubling. The day's agenda was packed with activities. Prince Alexander, the Crown Prince and heir to the throne, was scheduled to depart for a diplomatic mission to a neighboring country that afternoon. The trip had been planned for months and was considered crucial for maintaining regional stability and strengthening international relationships. As the eldest son of the king and queen, Alexander carried tremendous responsibility on his shoulders, and his safety during this mission was of paramount importance to both the royal family and the nation as a whole. Prince Alexander was a complex figure who had always lived under intense scrutiny. At 32 years old, he possessed the intelligence, charisma, and natural leadership qualities expected of a future monarch. He had been educated at the finest institutions, had served with distinction in the military, and had demonstrated a deep commitment to public service throughout his adult life. However, Alexander had also developed a reputation for being headstrong and occasionally impulsive, traits that sometimes put him at odds with the careful security protocols that governed his daily existence. Charlotte's relationship with Prince Alexander had evolved over the 3 years she had been protecting him. Initially, there had been some tension between them, as Alexander had been resistant to what he perceived as excessive security measures that limited his freedom and spontaneity. He had tested Charlotte's resolve on numerous occasions, attempting to deviate from planned routes, making unscheduled stops, and generally pushing the boundaries of what his security detail considered acceptable behavior. Over time, however, a mutual respect had developed between them. Charlotte had proven that she could be flexible and accommodating when circumstances permitted, while never compromising on essential security requirements. Alexander had come to appreciate her professionalism, her intelligence, and her genuine concern for his well-being. Their working relationship had become one of trust and understanding, though Alexander's independent streak still occasionally created challenges for Charlotte and her team. As Charlotte made her final preparations for the prince's departure, she received an unexpected summons to meet with Sir Marcus Rothwell, the palace's chief of security. Sir Marcus was a veteran of the intelligence services who had served the royal family for over 2 decades. His experience and wisdom had guided Charlotte throughout her career, and she held him in the highest regard. However, when she entered his office that morning, she immediately sensed that something was seriously wrong. Sir Marcus's usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain as he gestured for Charlotte to take a seat. The office, normally a place of calm efficiency, felt charged with tension. Maps, photographs, and intelligence reports were scattered across his desk in a way that suggested urgent activity and careful analysis. Charlotte's trained eye quickly noted the presence of several red folders marked with the highest security classifications, indicating that whatever was happening involved matters of national security. "Charlotte," Sir Marcus began, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately commanded her full attention. "I'm afraid we have a situation that requires your immediate attention and absolute discretion." He paused, studying her face carefully before continuing.
"We've received credible intelligence suggesting that Prince Alexander's upcoming trip may face significant security threats.
The nature of these threats is such that we cannot take any chances with his safety." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken as Sir Marcus outlined the details of what intelligence services had uncovered. Over the past several weeks, intercepted communications had revealed the existence of a plot targeting Prince Alexander during his diplomatic mission. The threats appeared to come from multiple sources, including political extremists opposed to the diplomatic agreements that Alexander was meant to negotiate, as well as criminal organizations that had financial interests in maintaining regional instability. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the sophisticated nature of the planned attacks. The intelligence suggested that the perpetrators had inside knowledge of the prince's travel plans, security protocols, and personal habits. This indicated the possible involvement of someone within the royal household or government circles, someone with access to highly classified information about the prince's movements and protection details. Sir Marcus explained that the decision had been made at the highest levels of government to proceed with the mission despite the threats. The diplomatic objectives were considered too important to abandon, and cancelling the trip would send a message of weakness that could have far-reaching consequences for the nation's international standing. However, extraordinary security measures would need to be implemented to ensure the prince's safety throughout the journey. Charlotte listened intently as Sir Marcus outlined the enhanced security protocols that would govern every aspect of the trip. Additional personnel would be assigned to the protection detail, backup plans would be developed for every phase of the mission, and contingency procedures would be established to deal with various threat scenarios. The entire operation would require precise coordination and flawless execution with no margin for error. As the briefing continued, Charlotte began to understand the full scope of the challenge that lay ahead. The threats were not limited to the destination country but extended to every phase of the journey, including the departure from the palace. Intelligence suggested that the initial attack might occur during the prince's transit to the airport, taking advantage of the brief period when he would be most vulnerable while moving between secure locations. The responsibility of ensuring Prince Alexander's safety during this critical phase would fall primarily on Charlotte and her immediate team. They would need to coordinate with local law enforcement, intelligence services, and military units to create a security corridor that could withstand sophisticated attacks while maintaining the appearance of a routine diplomatic departure. The challenge would be to provide maximum protection without creating such obvious security measures that they would alert potential attackers to the awareness of the threats. Sir Marcus emphasized the delicate balance that Charlotte would need to maintain throughout the operation. The prince could not be informed of the specific nature of the threats, as his knowledge might affect his behavior in ways that could compromise his safety or the mission's objectives. Charlotte would need to implement enhanced security measures while maintaining the appearance of routine procedures, a task that would require all of her skills in diplomacy and deception. As the briefing concluded, Charlotte felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The safety of the future king, the success of a crucial diplomatic mission, and potentially the security interests of the entire nation depended on her ability to anticipate threats, make split-second decisions, and coordinate complex security operations under extreme pressure. She had trained for moments like this throughout her career, but the reality of facing such a challenge was both exhilarating and terrifying. Charlotte spent the remainder of the morning reviewing intelligence reports, studying maps and photographs of the various routes and locations involved in the prince's departure, and coordinating with the numerous agencies and departments that would play roles in the security operation. Each detail had to be carefully planned and rehearsed, every contingency considered and prepared for. The margin for error was essentially zero. As noon approached, Charlotte conducted a final briefing with her immediate team, the core group of guards who would be directly responsible for the prince's physical protection during the departure phase. These were men and women she had worked with for years, individuals whose skills, judgment, and loyalty she trusted completely. Each of them understood the gravity of the situation, though they were not privy to all the details of the intelligence that had prompted the enhanced security measures. The team reviewed their positions, communication protocols, and emergency procedures one final time. Charlotte emphasized the importance of maintaining normal appearances while remaining alert for any signs of unusual activity or potential threats. Every member of the team was reminded that their primary responsibility was the prince's safety, and that no other consideration should take precedence over that fundamental duty. As Charlotte prepared to take her position for the prince's departure, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The years of training, the countless hours of study and preparation, the gradual building of experience and expertise had all led to this critical test of her abilities. She thought of her parents, who had instilled in her the values that now guided her actions, and of Sir Marcus, whose mentorship had shaped her into the professional she had become. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift the shadows in the palace courtyard, as Charlotte made her way to the departure area. Prince Alexander would soon emerge from his private quarters, ready to begin a journey that would test not only his diplomatic skills but also the security apparatus designed to protect him. Charlotte's team was in position, communications were established, and backup units were standing by at strategic locations throughout the city. Despite all the preparations, Charlotte knew that the real test was yet to come. Intelligence reports and security protocols could only prepare them so much for the unpredictable nature of real threats and the split-second decisions that might determine success or failure. Her instincts, training, and experience would be put to the ultimate test in the hours ahead, and the lives of those she was sworn to protect would depend on her ability to meet that challenge. As she took her final position and prepared to escort Prince Alexander to what everyone hoped would be a safe departure, Charlotte felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the moment she had trained for throughout her career, the test that would define her as a professional and as a person. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them with the courage, skill, and dedication that had brought her to this moment. The dramatic confrontation between duty and danger was about to begin, and Charlotte Williams stood ready to ensure that when it was over, those under her protection would be safe. The sound of polished shoes echoing through marble corridors announced Prince Alexander's approach long before Charlotte saw him emerge from his private wing of the palace. She had positioned herself at the predetermined checkpoint, where protocol demanded that she personally verify his readiness for departure and conduct a final security assessment. As the prince rounded the corner, accompanied by his personal valet and private secretary, Charlotte immediately noticed something that set her already heightened senses on full alert. Prince Alexander's demeanor was different from what she had observed during countless previous departures, where she typically saw focused determination mixed with the natural confidence that came with his royal upbringing. Today she detected an undercurrent of tension that seemed to radiate from him despite his composed exterior. His usually steady gait showed subtle signs of agitation, and his responses to his staff's questions were shorter and more clipped than usual. Something was clearly bothering him, though Charlotte couldn't immediately determine whether it stemmed from the diplomatic pressures of his upcoming mission or from some other source entirely. "Your Royal Highness," Charlotte said, executing the precise bow that protocol required, while simultaneously conducting a visual assessment of the prince and his immediate surroundings, "we're ready to proceed with your departure whenever you give the word. The route has been secured, and all stations are reporting ready status." Prince Alexander paused in his stride and fixed Charlotte with a look that seemed to carry more weight than a simple acknowledgement of her report. His dark eyes, which usually held a warmth that had endeared him to the public throughout his years of service, today seemed to be searching for something in her expression. For a moment, Charlotte wondered if somehow he had become aware of the enhanced security measures or the intelligence about potential threats that had prompted such careful planning for this departure. "Charlotte," the prince said, his voice carrying an odd formality that was unusual for their normally comfortable working relationship, "I need to speak with you privately before we proceed. There's something important we need to discuss." The request immediately raised red flags in Charlotte's mind. Deviation from established departure protocols was never taken lightly, particularly given the current threat environment. However, denying a direct request from the prince would create its own complications, and his obvious concern suggested that whatever he wanted to discuss might be relevant to their security planning. Charlotte quickly weighed the options and made the decision to grant his request while implementing appropriate safeguards. "Of course, Your Highness," she replied, gesturing toward a nearby sitting room that she knew had been swept for surveillance devices earlier that morning. "We can speak privately, but I'll need to have my team maintain visual contact for security purposes." Prince Alexander nodded his understanding and followed Charlotte into the elegantly appointed room. She positioned herself so that she could maintain sightlines to the doorway while keeping the prince within her immediate protection radius. Her team, following established protocols, took positions that would allow them to respond instantly to any threat while providing the privacy that the prince had requested. Once they were alone, Prince Alexander's carefully maintained composure seemed to shift slightly, revealing glimpses of the burden he carried as heir to the throne. He moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens, a view that had probably provided him comfort since childhood, but today seemed to offer little solace for whatever was troubling him. "Charlotte, I need to know," he began, his back still turned to her, as he gazed out at the manicured lawns and ancient oak trees. "Are there things about this trip that are not being told? Security considerations that go beyond the normal protocols for diplomatic missions?" The directness of his question caught Charlotte off guard, though her training immediately kicked in to help her formulate an appropriate response. She couldn't reveal the specific intelligence about threats against his life, both because of operational security requirements and because such knowledge might compromise his ability to carry out his diplomatic duties effectively. However, his question suggested that he had already sensed something unusual about the preparations for this departure. "Your Highness," Charlotte replied carefully, choosing her words with the precision that had been drilled into her during years of diplomatic security training. "Every mission you undertake involves careful security planning tailored to the specific circumstances and environment. The measures we've implemented for today's departure reflect current threat assessments and intelligence evaluations, all designed to ensure your safety while allowing you to fulfill your important diplomatic responsibilities." Prince Alexander turned from the window to face her directly, and Charlotte could see in his expression that her carefully diplomatic response had not fully satisfied his concerns. His intelligence and experience in matters of state had clearly allowed him to read between the lines of her answer, understanding that significant threats existed even if she couldn't provide specific details about their nature or source. "I see," he said quietly, moving away from the window to take a seat in one of the room's antique chairs. "And I suppose asking for more specific information would put you in an impossible position between your duty to protect me and your obligations to follow the directives of your superiors." Charlotte felt a surge of respect for the prince's understanding of the complex dynamics that governed her position. Throughout their years of working together, he had demonstrated an appreciation for the challenges faced by those charged with his protection, even when security requirements conflicted with his personal preferences or desires for greater freedom of movement.
Your understanding of the situation is appreciated, Your Highness, Charlotte replied.
"What I can tell you is that my team and I are fully prepared to ensure your safety, and that every precaution has been taken to address any potential security concerns. Our primary focus is on getting you safely to your destination so that you can successfully complete this important diplomatic mission." Prince Alexander studied her face for several moments, as if trying to gauge the full extent of what she wasn't telling him. Finally, he nodded slowly, seeming to accept that he would need to trust in her professional judgment and the security apparatus that surrounded him, even without knowing all the details of potential threats. "Very well," he said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace that came naturally to someone trained from birth in public presentation. "I'll trust in your expertise and that of your team. However, I want you to know that I'm prepared to face whatever challenges may arise, and I won't allow security concerns to prevent me from fulfilling my responsibilities to the crown and to our country." As they prepared to leave the sitting room and rejoin the departure preparations, Charlotte felt a moment of profound connection with the man she was sworn to protect. Despite the formal protocols that governed their interactions and the vast differences in their backgrounds and circumstances, she recognized in Prince Alexander the same sense of duty and commitment that drove her own dedication to service. Both of them understood that their roles required them to put larger responsibilities ahead of personal concerns or desires for safety and comfort. The departure area of the palace had been transformed during their brief private conversation. Where earlier there had been the usual organized efficiency of a routine diplomatic departure, now there was an intensified level of activity that reflected the enhanced security measures being implemented. Additional personnel had taken positions at strategic locations, communication equipment had been upgraded to military-grade specifications, and every aspect of the departure had been choreographed to minimize exposure to potential threats. Charlotte's immediate team had maintained their positions throughout her conversation with the prince, but she could see in their postures and expressions that they were operating at a heightened state of readiness. Each member of the team was a veteran of countless security operations, and their experience allowed them to sense when a routine assignment had evolved into something more serious and potentially dangerous. As Prince Alexander emerged from the sitting room and prepared to begin the final phase of his departure, Charlotte activated her communication system to coordinate with the various units positioned along their route to the airport. The responses she received confirmed that all stations were ready, and that no unusual activity had been detected in the areas through which they would be traveling. However, Charlotte's instincts continued to warn her that something was not quite right about the entire situation. The intelligence reports that had prompted the enhanced security measures had been thorough and credible, but they had also been somewhat vague about the specific timing and methods of potential attacks. This uncertainty meant that Charlotte and her team needed to be prepared for threats that could materialize at any moment and in any form. From traditional assassination attempts to sophisticated technological attacks that could target their vehicles or communication systems. Prince Alexander's personal vehicle, an armored limousine that had been specially designed to provide maximum protection while maintaining the dignity appropriate for royal transportation, had been thoroughly inspected and prepared for the journey. The vehicle's defensive systems had been tested and verified, escape routes had been programmed into the navigation system, and backup vehicles had been positioned at strategic intervals along their planned route. As the departure time approached, Charlotte conducted a final coordination check with all elements of the security operation. Air support units reported ready status from their positions above the city. Ground surveillance teams confirmed their coverage of critical intersections and potential ambush sites, and the special response units that would provide backup in case of emergency attacks were standing by at predetermined locations. Despite all these preparations, Charlotte knew that the most dangerous phase of any security operation was often the transition from a secure location to mobile status. The brief period when the prince would be moving from the palace to his vehicle represented a window of vulnerability that even the most sophisticated security measures couldn't completely eliminate. Her team had practiced these transitions countless times, but the reality of potential threats made every movement and every second critically important. Prince Alexander approached his vehicle with the composed bearing that had been ingrained in him through decades of public appearances. But Charlotte could see that he was fully aware of the gravity of the situation. His private security briefing had clearly conveyed to him that this departure was unlike his routine travels, even if he hadn't been provided with specific details about the nature of the threats they were preparing to face. As Charlotte opened the vehicle door for the prince, she conducted one final visual sweep of the immediate area. Her trained eyes searched for anything that seemed out of place or potentially threatening. Unusual movements among the palace staff, unfamiliar faces in the crowd of well-wishers who had gathered to see the prince off, or any signs that the carefully orchestrated security plan might have been compromised in some way. The moment when Prince Alexander settled into his seat and Charlotte closed the vehicle door behind him marked the beginning of the most critical phase of the operation. From this point forward, they would be committed to following their planned route and timeline, with limited opportunities to make adjustments if new threats emerged. Charlotte's role would shift from static security management to dynamic threat assessment and response, requiring her to make potentially life-or-death decisions based on rapidly changing circumstances and incomplete information. As the convoy began to move through the palace gates and onto the streets of the capital city, Charlotte felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied high-stakes security operations. Every sense was heightened, every instinct was alert, and every member of her team was prepared to respond instantly to whatever challenges might arise during their journey to the airport. The early phases of their route took them through areas that were under the tightest security control, with each intersection cleared and secured in advance of their arrival. However, Charlotte knew that as they moved further from the palace and closer to the airport, the security environment would become progressively more complex and potentially more dangerous. The intelligence about potential attacks had been vague about specific locations, meaning that threats could emerge at any point during their journey. Communication chatter from the various security units monitoring their progress provided a steady stream of updates about conditions along their route. So far, all reports indicated normal activity and no signs of unusual preparations or movements that might indicate an imminent attack. However, Charlotte's experience had taught her that the absence of obvious threats didn't necessarily mean that dangers weren't present, just that they might be more sophisticated or better concealed than anticipated. As their convoy moved through the city streets, Charlotte maintained constant communication with Prince Alexander, providing him with updates about their progress while carefully avoiding any details that might cause unnecessary alarm or anxiety. The prince, for his part, seemed to understand that this was a time for him to trust in the expertise of those charged with his protection and to focus on preparing mentally for the diplomatic challenges that awaited him at his destination. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came as a crackling voice through Charlotte's earpiece when they were approximately halfway to the airport. The message was brief but chilling in its implications. Surveillance teams had detected unusual movement patterns around several key intersections ahead of their planned route, with unidentified vehicles appearing to take positions that could facilitate either surveillance or attack operations against their convoy. Charlotte's training immediately took over as she processed this information and began calculating their options. Changing routes at this point would involve significant risks, as their alternate paths hadn't been as thoroughly secured and cleared as their primary corridor. However, continuing on their current path knowing that potentially hostile forces were positioning themselves ahead of them would be equally dangerous, if not more so. "Control, this is Eagle 1. Charlotte spoke quietly into her microphone, using the code designation for the prince's vehicle. "Please confirm the nature and extent of unusual activity detected ahead of our position. Are we looking at possible surveillance or active threat positioning?" The response came back within seconds, but it brought more troubling information rather than the clarification Charlotte had hoped for. Intelligence analysts monitoring the situation had identified at least 3 separate groups of vehicles that appeared to be coordinating their movements in a pattern consistent with preparation for an ambush or attack operation. The vehicles themselves were clean, with no obvious weapons or suspicious modifications visible, but their positioning and timing suggested a level of organization that went well beyond coincidental traffic patterns. Charlotte glanced at Prince Alexander, who was reviewing diplomatic briefing materials in the seat beside her. His concentration seemed absolute, but she could detect subtle signs that he was aware of the increased tension in their vehicle and among the security team. His years of experience with protection details had given him an ability to sense when routine operations shifted into crisis mode, even when specific details weren't shared with him. The decision Charlotte faced was one that would define her career and potentially determine the prince's safety. Intelligence suggested that proceeding on their planned route could lead them directly into a carefully prepared trap, but deviating from their security plan would expose them to unknown risks and potentially compromise the backup systems that had been put in place to protect them. Every option carried significant dangers, and the window for making a decision was rapidly closing as their convoy continued moving toward the areas where hostile activity had been detected. "Your Highness," Charlotte said, keeping her voice calm and professional despite the urgency of the situation, "we're receiving reports of unusual traffic conditions ahead. I'm going to recommend that we implement our alternate route protocol to ensure we maintain our schedule and avoid any potential delays." Prince Alexander looked up from his briefing materials and studied Charlotte's expression for a moment. His intelligence and experience allowed him to understand that her mention of unusual traffic conditions was diplomatic language for something much more serious than routine congestion. However, he also understood that questioning her recommendations at this critical moment could interfere with her ability to manage whatever crisis was developing. "I trust your judgment completely," he replied simply, then returned his attention to his briefing materials while Charlotte coordinated the route change with her team and the various support units monitoring their progress. The alternate route would take them through a less direct path to the airport, adding approximately 15 minutes to their journey, but providing access to corridors that had been prepared as backup options during the planning phase of the operation. While these routes hadn't received the same level of advanced security preparation as their primary path, they had been surveyed and cleared of obvious threats, and emergency response units had been positioned to provide support if needed. As Charlotte coordinated the route change, she received additional intelligence that made the wisdom of their decision abundantly clear. The surveillance teams monitoring the suspicious vehicle activity had observed what appeared to be weapons being moved into position at strategic points along their original route. The sophistication of the operation suggested that they were dealing with a well-funded and highly organized threat, possibly with inside knowledge of their security plans and procedures. The realization that their security may have been compromised sent a chill through Charlotte as she considered the implications. If hostile forces had access to their planned routes and timing, they might also have information about their alternate options, their backup procedures, and even their emergency protocols. This possibility meant that every decision she made from this point forward would need to account for the fact that their enemies might be anticipating their moves. Charlotte immediately activated additional security measures that had been held in reserve for exactly this type of situation. Military units that had been standing by were moved into active support positions. Aerial surveillance was intensified, and specialized counterattack teams were deployed to provide emergency response capability if the convoy came under direct assault. The entire security operation was escalating from a protective escort to what was essentially a combat mission in an urban environment. Prince Alexander's vehicle was equipped with state-of-the-art defensive systems, including armor plating capable of stopping most small arms fire, bullet-resistant windows, and emergency communication equipment that could maintain contact with security forces even under the most challenging conditions. However, Charlotte knew that no defensive system was perfect, and that a determined and well-equipped enemy could potentially overcome even the most sophisticated protective measures. As their convoy turned onto the alternate route, Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on her shoulders. Every decision she made would have consequences not just for the prince's immediate safety, but potentially for the success of his diplomatic mission and the broader security interests of their nation. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the margin for error was essentially zero. The new route took them through neighborhoods that were less familiar to Charlotte and her team, requiring them to rely more heavily on real-time intelligence and their own tactical instincts. The buildings were older and more densely packed, creating numerous potential hiding spots for enemies and limiting the sightlines that would allow the security team to detect threats before they became immediate dangers. Communication chatter increased dramatically as various units reported their observations and coordinated their movements to provide maximum coverage for the convoy. Charlotte found herself processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Updates from ground surveillance teams, reports from aerial reconnaissance, intelligence assessments from analysts monitoring electronic communications, and tactical recommendations from military advisors supporting the operation. Despite the complexity of the situation, Charlotte's training and experience allowed her to maintain a clear picture of their overall tactical situation. The immediate threat appeared to be behind them now, as the suspicious activity had been concentrated along their original route. However, the sophistication of the enemy's initial positioning suggested that they might have backup plans and alternative attack options that could still pose serious dangers. As they progressed through the alternate route, Charlotte received a report that made her blood run cold. Intelligence intercepts had revealed communications suggesting that the attack they had avoided was only the first phase of a larger operation designed to target the prince during multiple phases of his journey. The enemies they were dealing with weren't just planning a single ambush, but rather a coordinated campaign that could include attacks during his departure, his flight, or even his arrival at his destination. This revelation transformed Charlotte's understanding of the threat they were facing. Instead of dealing with a single group of attackers focused on one opportunity, they were apparently up against an organization capable of mounting sustained operations across multiple locations and phases of the prince's trip. The level of resources and coordination required for such an effort suggested involvement by state actors or extremely well-funded criminal organizations. Charlotte immediately shared this new intelligence with Sir Marcus and the other senior officials coordinating the overall security operation. The implications were staggering. If enemies were prepared to attack during multiple phases of the journey, then enhanced security measures would be needed not just for the remainder of their trip to the airport, but for every aspect of the prince's mission, including his flight, his activities at his destination, and his eventual return home. The decision was made at the highest levels to implement what was essentially a wartime security posture for the entire diplomatic mission. Military aircraft would provide escort during the prince's flight, special forces units would be deployed to his destination to supplement local security arrangements, and emergency extraction plans would be developed in case the mission needed to be terminated early due to security concerns. As these enhanced measures were being coordinated, Charlotte focused on the immediate challenge of getting Prince Alexander safely to the airport and aboard his aircraft. Their convoy was now moving through the final phase of the alternate route, approaching the airport perimeter where additional security layers had been established to protect against attacks during the vulnerable transition from ground to air transportation. The airport itself had been transformed into essentially a military installation for the duration of the prince's departure. Commercial flights had been temporarily suspended, civilian access to terminal areas had been restricted, and specialized security teams had swept every inch of the facilities that the prince would use during his departure process. However, Charlotte knew that even the most thorough security preparations couldn't eliminate all risks, particularly when facing enemies with the apparent sophistication and resources of those targeting the prince. As their convoy approached the airport gates, Charlotte received final confirmation that all security stations were ready for the prince's arrival. Sniper teams had been positioned on strategic buildings around the airport, explosive detection equipment had been deployed throughout the terminal areas, and emergency medical facilities had been established in case of injury during any potential attacks. Prince Alexander had remained remarkably composed throughout their journey, continuing to review his diplomatic briefing materials and maintaining the focused demeanor that would be essential for the success of his mission. However, Charlotte could see that he was fully aware of the gravity of the situation they were facing, and she felt a deep sense of respect for his courage and commitment to fulfilling his duties despite the obvious dangers. The transition from their convoy to the airport facilities would represent another critical vulnerability, as the prince would need to exit his protected vehicle and move across open areas before reaching the security of the terminal building. Charlotte's team had rehearsed these procedures countless times, that the reality of implementing them under active threat conditions required split-second timing and flawless coordination among all the various security elements. As their vehicle came to a stop at the designated arrival point, Charlotte conducted one final assessment of their immediate surroundings. Her eyes swept across the various personnel positions, searching for any signs that the carefully orchestrated security plan might have been compromised or that enemies might have found ways to infiltrate the protected areas around the airport. The moment had arrived when all of their planning, training, and preparation would be put to the ultimate test. Charlotte's hand moved to her weapon as she prepared to escort Prince Alexander from his vehicle to the safety of the aircraft that would carry him to his destination. Every instinct, every skill, and every ounce of training she possessed would be focused on ensuring that this transition was completed successfully and that the prince reached his aircraft without harm. As Charlotte opened the vehicle door and prepared to step out first to clear the way for Prince Alexander, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with moments of supreme challenge and responsibility. The next few minutes would determine whether all of their security measures had been sufficient to protect against the sophisticated threats they were facing, and whether her leadership and decisions would prove equal to the challenges of this extraordinary situation. Charlotte's feet touched the tarmac with a confidence that betrayed none of the tension coursing through her body. Her eyes immediately began their practice sweep of the environment, cataloging every detail that could represent either safety or threat. The airport had been transformed into what resembled a military staging area, with personnel from multiple security agencies positioned at strategic points throughout the departure zone. Despite these extensive preparations, Charlotte's instincts warned her that their most dangerous moments still lay ahead. The walk from the vehicle to Prince Alexander's aircraft would cover approximately 100 meters across open tarmac, a distance that represented maximum vulnerability despite the presence of numerous protective measures. Sniper teams positioned on surrounding buildings could provide overwatch, but the open nature of the terrain meant that potential attackers would have multiple angles from which to launch an assault. Charlotte's team had prepared for this phase of the departure with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized their entire security operation. But she knew that no amount of planning could account for every possible contingency. Prince Alexander emerged from the vehicle with the measured confidence that had been ingrained in him through years of public appearances under challenging circumstances. His bearing showed no signs of the tension that must have been affecting him, and Charlotte felt a surge of professional admiration for his ability to maintain composure under such extraordinary pressure. The success of his diplomatic mission would depend not just on his physical safety, but on his ability to project strength and confidence throughout the journey, beginning with these moments of public visibility during his departure. As they began their walk across the tarmac, Charlotte maintained constant communication with the various security elements monitoring their progress. Her earpiece carried a steady stream of updates from sniper teams reporting clear sightlines, surveillance units confirming no unusual activity in the surrounding areas, and explosive detection teams providing final clearance for their path to the aircraft. However, underneath the routine nature of these reports, Charlotte could detect an undercurrent of heightened alertness that reflected everyone's awareness of the serious threats they were potentially facing. The aircraft that would carry Prince Alexander to his destination was a specially modified diplomatic transport equipped with defensive systems, secure communications equipment, and emergency medical facilities. The plane had undergone extensive security inspections, and its crew consisted of carefully vetted personnel with experience in high-risk operations. However, Charlotte knew that even the most sophisticated aircraft defenses couldn't provide complete protection against determined attackers equipped with advanced weapon systems. Halfway across the tarmac, Charlotte received a communication that made her instantly increase her vigilance. Intelligence teams monitoring electronic communications in the area had detected what appeared to be coordination signals among unidentified parties in the vicinity of the airport. The nature of these communications suggested possible preparation for an imminent attack, though the specific timing and method remained unclear from the intercepts that had been obtained. Charlotte's training kicked in as she processed this information and began calculating response options. Rushing the prince to the aircraft could make them more vulnerable to attack by breaking the careful choreography of their security plan, but maintaining their current pace might give potential attackers more time to execute whatever operation they were preparing. The decision she made in the next few seconds could determine the difference between a successful departure and a catastrophic security failure.
Eagle 1 to all units. Charlotte spoke quietly into her microphone while maintaining her steady pace beside Prince Alexander.
Implement Code Yellow procedures immediately. All stations maintain heightened alert status and report any unusual activity without delay. Code Yellow represented an intermediate threat level that would activate additional protective measures, without creating the obvious signs of alarm that might either tip off attackers or cause unnecessary panic among the personnel supporting the departure. Sniper teams would intensify their surveillance, response units would move to advanced positions, and communication protocols would be enhanced to ensure instant coordination if an attack materialized. Prince Alexander gave no indication that he had noticed the subtle increase in activity around them, though Charlotte suspected that his experience with security operations allowed him to sense the elevated tension among his protection detail. His continued focus on maintaining a confident and composed demeanor was exactly what the situation required, both for his personal safety and for the broader implications of his diplomatic mission. As they approached the aircraft stairs, Charlotte felt a brief moment of relief that they had successfully completed the most vulnerable phase of their departure without incident. However, her celebration was premature, as a new communication through her earpiece brought information that transformed their situation from one of potential threat to immediate crisis. Intelligence analysis of the electronic intercepts had revealed that the coordination signals detected earlier were part of a sophisticated attack plan targeting the prince's aircraft during takeoff. The attackers appeared to have access to portable surface-to-air missile systems and were positioning themselves for strikes that would target the aircraft during its most vulnerable moments after leaving the ground. The sophistication of their equipment and tactics suggested military-grade capabilities that would pose serious challenges even for the aircraft's defensive systems. Charlotte's mind raced as she calculated their options. Cancelling the departure at this late stage would be extremely difficult and potentially dangerous, as it would require moving the prince back across the open tarmac, where he could be vulnerable to ground-based attacks. However, proceeding with the takeoff knowing that missile systems were being positioned against them would be equally risky, particularly given the limited defensive capabilities available to aircraft during their initial climb phase. The decision was made for her when additional intelligence revealed that the suspected missile teams were moving into final attack positions and would likely be ready to engage within the next few minutes. There was no time for extensive consultation or elaborate contingency planning. Charlotte would need to make an immediate decision based on her assessment of the available options and the relative risks of each course of action. "Control, this is Eagle 1, she said urgently into her microphone, while maintaining her calm exterior appearance. "We have confirmed hostile activity targeting our departure, requesting immediate implementation of emergency protocols and authorization for defensive countermeasures." The response came back within seconds, authorizing the activation of all available defensive systems and the immediate deployment of counterattack units to neutralize the missile threat. Military helicopters that had been standing by in reserve positions were scrambled to engage the suspected attack teams, while electronic warfare specialists began implementing measures to disrupt any guidance systems that might be targeting the prince's aircraft. Charlotte guided Prince Alexander up the aircraft stairs while coordinating the various defensive measures that were being activated around them. The prince's demeanor remained composed, though she could see in his expression that he understood they were facing an immediate and serious threat to his safety. His continued cooperation and calm behavior under such extraordinary circumstances reflected both his personal courage and his understanding of the critical importance of allowing his security team to do their jobs without interference. As they reached the aircraft door, Charlotte received confirmation that hostile missile teams had been identified and were being engaged by counterattack units. The sound of distant explosions could be heard across the airport as military forces moved to eliminate the threat before the aircraft attempted takeoff. However, the complexity of the airport environment and the need to avoid civilian casualties meant that the engagement would require time to complete successfully. Inside the aircraft, Charlotte coordinated with the flight crew to ensure that all defensive systems were activated and ready for immediate use. The pilot, a veteran of numerous high-risk operations, confirmed that the aircraft was prepared for emergency departure procedures that would maximize their chances of avoiding missile attack during takeoff. These procedures involved rapid acceleration and evasive maneuvering that would be uncomfortable but potentially life-saving if they came under direct attack. Prince Alexander took his seat in the aircraft's secure cabin, while Charlotte maintained communication with the ground forces engaging the hostile missile teams. The reports she received were cautiously optimistic, indicating that several suspected launch positions had been neutralized, but intelligence suggested that additional threats might still be present in the area surrounding the airport. The decision of when to attempt takeoff involved balancing multiple risk factors. Waiting too long could allow additional enemy forces to move into position or could give the existing threats time to relocate and prepare new attack positions. However, departing too quickly might result in taking off while missile systems were still operational and capable of targeting their aircraft during its vulnerable climb phase. Charlotte's experience and training guided her analysis of the tactical situation as reports continued to flow in from the various units engaged in neutralizing the threats around the airport. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated and well-coordinated attack plan that had involved multiple teams positioned at different locations around the airport perimeter. The level of organization and resources required for such an operation confirmed that they were dealing with a highly capable enemy, with significant financial backing and possibly state-level support. As the minutes passed, the counterattack operations began to show results. Military units reported successfully neutralizing several missile teams and recovering advanced weapon systems that would provide valuable intelligence about the capabilities and organization of their enemies. However, the possibility remained that additional threats could still be present but undetected in the complex terrain around the airport. The final decision to proceed with takeoff came when intelligence analysis indicated that the immediate missile threat had been substantially reduced, though not completely eliminated. The risks of remaining on the ground were assessed as greater than the risks of departure, particularly given the possibility that enemy ground forces might attempt to assault the airport directly if given sufficient time to regroup and prepare new attack plans. Charlotte strapped herself into her seat as the aircraft prepared for emergency departure procedures. The engine spooled up to full power much more rapidly than during a normal takeoff, and the aircraft began its roll down the runway with an acceleration that pressed everyone back into their seats. The pilot's voice came through the intercom, informing them that defensive countermeasures were armed and ready for deployment if they detected incoming missiles during their climb. The takeoff itself was unlike anything Charlotte had experienced during her years of protecting the royal family. Instead of the smooth, comfortable ascent typical of diplomatic flights, the aircraft climbed at maximum rate while performing evasive maneuvers designed to complicate targeting by any remaining ground-based threats. The physical discomfort was significant, but Charlotte felt a surge of relief as they gained altitude and distance from the airport where so many threats had been concentrated. As they reached cruising altitude and the aircraft settled into more normal flight patterns, Charlotte received confirmation that the immediate crisis had passed successfully. All identified missile teams had been neutralized, and no additional threats had been detected in the airport area. However, the intelligence gathered during the engagement painted a troubling picture of the enemy's capabilities and suggested that additional threats might await them at their destination or during other phases of the prince's mission. Prince Alexander had endured the dramatic departure with the same composed dignity that had characterized his behavior throughout the crisis. As the aircraft leveled off and normal operations resumed, he looked at Charlotte with an expression that conveyed both gratitude for her protection and understanding of the extraordinary challenges they had faced together. His safety had been preserved through a combination of careful planning, professional skill, and considerable good fortune, but the mission was far from over. Charlotte used the relative calm of the flight to coordinate with intelligence services about the threats they might face during the remainder of the prince's journey. The sophistication of the attack they had just survived suggested that their enemies possessed capabilities that extended well beyond the borders of their home country, and that additional security measures would be needed to ensure the prince's safety during his diplomatic activities and eventual return home. The relative quiet of cruising altitude provided Charlotte with her first opportunity to fully process the magnitude of what they had just survived. As she reviewed the intelligence reports streaming into the aircraft's secure communication systems, the scope of the conspiracy against Prince Alexander became increasingly clear. The attack they had narrowly avoided was part of a coordinated international operation involving multiple terrorist cells, sophisticated weapon systems, and what appeared to be support from hostile foreign intelligence services. Analysis of the weapons recovered from the neutralized missile teams revealed technology that was not readily available on black markets, suggesting that state actors had provided equipment and possibly training to the groups targeting the prince. The implications were staggering, as they indicated that Prince Alexander's diplomatic mission had attracted the attention of enemies willing to risk international incidents and potential military retaliation to prevent his success. Charlotte found herself grappling with the realization that her role in protecting the prince had evolved from personal security to a matter of national security with international implications. The successful completion of his diplomatic mission was apparently considered so threatening by certain parties that they were prepared to commit what amounted to acts of war to prevent it. This understanding transformed her perspective on the remainder of their journey and the challenges they would likely face before returning home safely. Prince Alexander had been briefed on the essential details of what they had discovered, though certain sensitive intelligence about potential foreign government involvement was withheld to avoid compromising his ability to conduct diplomatic negotiations effectively. His response to learning about the sophisticated nature of the threats against him was characteristic of his courage and commitment to duty. He expressed determination to continue with his mission despite the obvious dangers and insisted that security concerns should not be allowed to interfere with his diplomatic objectives. As their aircraft continued toward its destination, Charlotte coordinated with security forces at their arrival airport to ensure that adequate protective measures were being implemented. The intelligence about the international scope of the conspiracy had prompted massive security upgrades, including the deployment of military units to provide backup support for local law enforcement, and the establishment of secure zones around all locations where the prince would be conducting his diplomatic activities. The landscape visible through the aircraft windows gradually changed as they approached their destination, but Charlotte's attention remained focused on the stream of intelligence updates and security briefings that continued to flow through their communication systems. Each report brought additional details about the enemy organization they were facing, painting a picture of a well-funded, highly organized, and technologically sophisticated threat that posed challenges unlike anything she had encountered during her career. Intelligence services had identified at least 12 separate cells operating in the destination country, each with specific assignments related to targeting different phases of the prince's visit. The level of coordination required for such an operation suggested months or possibly years of advanced planning, indicating that the enemies they faced had been preparing for this diplomatic mission long before the official announcements of the prince's travel plans. The aircraft's defensive systems remained on high alert throughout the flight, as intelligence indicated that surface-to-air threats might extend beyond the borders of their home country. Military escort aircraft had been dispatched to provide protection during their final approach and landing, and electronic warfare specialists were monitoring communication frequencies for signs of hostile activity in the airspace around their destination airport. As they began their descent toward the destination airport, Charlotte felt the familiar tension that accompanied high-risk operations reaching their critical phases. The landing phase would present new vulnerabilities, as their aircraft would need to follow predictable approach patterns that could potentially be exploited by enemies with advanced weapons systems. However, the extensive security measures that had been implemented provided layers of protection that should be sufficient to counter most conceivable threats. The destination airport had been transformed into essentially a military installation for the duration of their visit. Commercial flights had been suspended, civilian access had been severely restricted, and specialized counterterrorism units had taken control of all security operations. Charlotte received confirmation that multiple defensive systems had been deployed around the airport perimeter, including radar installations capable of detecting incoming missiles and electronic warfare equipment designed to disrupt guidance systems. Prince Alexander prepared for landing with the same composed professionalism that had characterized his behavior throughout their challenging journey. Charlotte could see that the weight of responsibility he carried was enormous, as the success or failure of his diplomatic mission could have far-reaching consequences for regional stability and international relations. The fact that so many enemies were determined to prevent his success only emphasized the critical importance of the agreements he hoped to negotiate. The landing itself proceeded without incident, though Charlotte remained alert for any signs that hostile forces might attempt to attack during the vulnerable moments when their aircraft was on approach, or during the transition from air to ground transportation. The military escort aircraft maintained their protective formation until the prince's plane had safely touched down and reached its designated secure parking area. As Charlotte prepared to escort Prince Alexander from the aircraft to the waiting ground transportation, she received final intelligence briefings about the security situation they would face during their time at the destination. The reports were sobering, indicating that enemy forces had established positions throughout the city and were prepared to attempt multiple attacks during different phases of the diplomatic visit. The level of threat was unprecedented in Charlotte's experience, requiring constant vigilance and flawless coordination among all elements of their expanded security team. The transition from aircraft to ground transportation was accomplished with military precision, as Charlotte's team coordinated with local security forces and international support units to create a secure corridor. The prince's armored vehicle was surrounded by escort vehicles, with additional backup units positioned at strategic intervals along their route to the diplomatic facilities where his meetings would take place. The city through which they traveled showed obvious signs of the massive security operation that had been implemented for the prince's visit. Military checkpoints were visible at key intersections, civilian traffic had been restricted in certain areas, and emergency response units were positioned throughout the urban area. While these measures provided enhanced security, they also created a visible reminder of the serious nature of the threats they were facing. Charlotte's communication with intelligence analysts continued throughout their journey to the diplomatic compound, providing her with real-time updates about potential threats and the status of ongoing counterterrorism operations. The picture that emerged was of a city under siege, with friendly forces working around the clock to identify and neutralize enemy cells before they could execute their attack plans. The diplomatic compound where Prince Alexander would conduct his negotiations had been fortified to military standards, with multiple layers of security including electronic surveillance systems, explosive detection equipment, and specialized personnel trained in diplomatic protection. However, Charlotte knew that even the most sophisticated defensive measures could be overcome by determined attackers with sufficient resources and planning time. As they arrived at the compound and Prince Alexander prepared to begin his diplomatic activities, Charlotte felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. They had successfully survived the most dangerous phases of their journey and had reached their destination without loss of life or serious injury. However, the intelligence about ongoing threats meant that constant vigilance would be required throughout their stay, and that the return journey would likely present additional challenges. The success of Prince Alexander's diplomatic mission would depend not only on his negotiating skills and the merits of the agreements he hoped to reach, but also on the ability of Charlotte and her expanded security team to protect him from a sophisticated and determined enemy. The stakes couldn't have been higher, as failure could result not only in the loss of a future king, but also in the collapse of crucial international agreements that could affect regional stability for years to come. Charlotte took her position as the prince entered the diplomatic facilities, knowing that her role in this extraordinary mission was far from over. The challenges they had faced during their departure and journey had tested every aspect of her training and experience. But the real test would be maintaining security throughout the complex diplomatic activities ahead, and ensuring safe passage home when the mission was complete. As the first day of diplomatic meetings began, Charlotte coordinated security operations from a command center that had been established within the compound. The intelligence flowing through her communication systems painted a picture of ongoing cat-and-mouse operations throughout the city, as friendly forces worked to stay ahead of enemy plans and capabilities. Each successful neutralization of a threat seemed to reveal additional layers of the conspiracy, suggesting that the full scope of the enemy operation had yet to be completely understood. The diplomatic negotiations themselves proceeded with the careful formality that characterized high-level international relations. But Charlotte could see that all participants were aware of the extraordinary security situation surrounding the meetings. Prince Alexander's performance under such pressure was exemplary, demonstrating the leadership qualities and personal courage that made him worthy of the protection she and her team were providing. As evening approached, and the first day of formal negotiations concluded, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The transformation from what had begun as a routine diplomatic mission to a complex international security operation involving multiple nations and agencies was unlike anything in her experience. However, the successful management of the crisis had validated years of training and preparation, and had demonstrated the effectiveness of international cooperation in facing sophisticated threats. The mission was far from over, with additional days of negotiations ahead and the challenging return journey still to come. However, Charlotte felt confident that the security measures they had implemented would be sufficient to protect Prince Alexander and ensure the success of his critical diplomatic objectives. The threats they faced were serious and sophisticated, but the combined efforts of dedicated professionals from multiple countries had proven capable of meeting even the most extraordinary challenges. As night fell over the diplomatic compound and security forces maintained their vigilant watch, Charlotte prepared for what would likely be several more days of high-tension operations. The safety of Prince Alexander and the success of his mission remained her primary responsibilities, and she was determined to fulfill those obligations regardless of the challenges that lay ahead. The dramatic confrontation between duty and danger that had begun with their departure from the palace would continue until they were safely home, and Charlotte Williams stood ready to face whatever trials awaited them in the days to come.